Who is Jeff Koons?
Jeff Koons, 1955, is a controversial, highly successful contemporary artist known for monumental, brightly colored sculpture and art produced by large teams of assistants. A former commodities broker who trained at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Maryland Institute College of Art, Koons creates art that critiques commercialism. For example, he displayed vacuum cleaners in clear, perspex boxes, in a series called The New 1979, and later began making enormous, highly polished balloon animal sculptures that were praised for their technical virtuosity, and criticized for their over-the-top decadence. Koons is also famous for his large topiary sculpture, Puppy, 1992, and his Rococo-esque sculpture, Michael Jackson and Bubbles, 1988, a golden, ceramic sculpture of the King of Pop with his pet monkey. Koons' art is polarizing because it blurs the line between high art and spectacle, which some say is exactly the point.
Who were the Limborg brothers?
The three Limburg brothers were the most famous manuscript illuminators in Flanders, and worked near the end of the 14th century and the early 15th century. Paul, Herman, and Jean were originally trained as goldsmiths in Paris and went on to become the official court painters to the Duke of Berry around 1404. Arguably their most important work was the Trace Riches Heures, a book of hours made especially for the Duke. The book included calendar pages, which listed saints' feast days, zodiac signs, and astrological information. The Limburg brothers completed fantastically realistic, full-page paintings for each month of the year. The paintings are full of life and vivacity, for example, the deep blues and powdery whites of the February page evoke the chill of winter. The brothers used very fine brushes, and most likely magnified lenses, in order to achieve such a high level of detail. The work of the Limburg brothers is a good example of the international Gothic style.
Where can I see art in my area?
Art is all around us, especially if you are looking for it. Be sure to check out local galleries and museums, which usually have both permanent collections and temporary exhibitions that change regularly. Cafes, bookstores, and frame shops also often hang original art by local artists on the walls and sometimes have talks about art. These are great places to meet other people who are interested in art, especially during the summer months. Arts and crafts fairs and festivals are frequently held in downtowns, parks, and fairgrounds. Search online or stop in at your local arts and crafts store, gallery, or cafe. which might have some information on upcoming art events. I want to learn more.
What is the difference between the work of Hokusai and Hiroshige?
Katsushika Hokusai, 1760 to 1849, and Yutagawa Hiroshige, 1797 to 1858, were two of the most successful landscape painters in 19th century Japan. And their prints are among the most recognizable examples of graphic art in the world. Both artists explored the transience of the material world in their ukiyo-e paintings. Hokusai was especially well known for his series, 36 Views of Mount Fuji. His print, The Great Wave off Kanagawa, represents a monumental wave cresting with stylized foam, about to crash near a group of men in long, graceful boats shaped to mirror the curves of the ocean swells. Appearing unexpectedly in the background is the distant image of snow-capped Mount Fuji, which lies low along the horizon line. The white peak of Mount Fuji looks similar to a white-capped swell in the foreground, making the formidable mountain appear as temporary as an ocean wave. The Great Wave is an example of Hokusai's use of the European color, Prussian blue, and demonstrates the simplicity and dynamism of Japanese art during the Edo period. Like Hokusai, Hiroshige was a master of the Edo period who specialized in landscapes. Some of his prints also include images of Mount Fuji, including view of Mount Fuji from Sata Point in the Tsuruga Bay. 1589, a woodcut that depicts a curling wave similar to the one painted by Hokusai. Hiroshige was almost 40 years younger than Hokusai, and was greatly inspired by the older artist's work. Among his most famous works were his prints for the series 100 Views of Edo, 1856 to 1859, which were completed by his student, Hiroshige II. His prints often rely on an understanding of perspective to create depth, and his style had a major impact on Dutch artist Vincent van Gogh, who created an oil painting based on a Hashi bridge. In the Rain in 1887. Hiroshige street scenes in prints such as Night View of Sarawakamaki, 1856. Also inspired Impressionist artists such as Auguste Renoir and Camille Pissarro. Hiroshige was working in Japan at a time when the country was opening its doors to the outside world after centuries of isolation. And his work captures the changes occurring in the 19th century through a lens of the ukiyo-e tradition.
What is watercolor?
While oil paints are made by mixing pigment with oil, watercolors are made by mixing pigment with water, usually for use on paper. Watercolors are applied in washes, which create a light, transparent area of color. Before the 19th century, watercolor was mostly used for quick sketches and was not considered to be as refined as other types of painting. However, perceptions of watercolor changed after John Ruskin, A famous 19th century art critic promoted it, and the artist J.M.W. Turner, who also painted in oil, used watercolor for his dramatic and monumental paintings. Watercolor is still a popular medium used by artists around the world.
What is Cubism?
Cubism was a revolutionary development in modernist art that began in the early 20th century and lasted for decades. Cubism is characterized by fragmented images, or images that have been broken up and viewed from multiple angles. Cubism has its roots in the post-impressionist work of Paul Cézanne and primitivism. It is most closely associated with the work of Picasso and Georges Braque. 1882 to 1963, as well as Juan Gris, 1887 to 1927, and Fernand Léger, 1881 to 1955. Cubism can be considered an attempt to distill complex visual images into an aesthetically unified whole. Cubist artists are interested in capturing the essence of an object and placing it in visual context. The development of Cubism has been linked by some scholars to the massive cultural and social changes taking place during the turn of the century, including enormous changes in technology and industry. Cubism is divided into various phases, the earliest of which are analytic cubism and synthetic cubism. Analytic cubism was developed by Picasso and Braque in 1909. A good example of analytic cubism is Braque's Violin and Palette. 1909 to 1910, in which the image of a violin has been fragmented, as if the violin was made of shattered glass that has been swept up into a pile of crystal-like shards. Each shard of the violin is visually analyzed in the painting, allowing the viewer to contemplate the physical characteristics of the instrument in a new way. During the analytic cubist phase, Picasso and Braque painted objects that were almost, but not completely, dissolved into abstraction. By contrast, synthetic cubism is characterized by simple forms, less abstraction, and the use of collage, a process in which the artist applies elements, such as newspaper, to the canvas with glue. Examples of synthetic cubism include Picasso's still life with mandolin and guitar, 1924, and his collage piece, Glass and Bottle of Susie, 1912. Cubism was revolutionary for a number of reasons. It was the first modern art movement in which artists experimented with near-total abstraction. And it went on to inspire other art movements, including suprematism, futurism, and constructivism.
What was Chichen Itza?
Chichen Itza was an important pre-Columbian city built by the Maya and located in the eastern portion of the Yucatan Peninsula in modern-day Mexico. Chichen Itza is known for a large 9-level pyramid, which sits at the center of a main plaza. The pyramid is topped with a small, square temple accessible by 4 staircases. one on each side of the structure. The site also includes ball-playing courts, palaces, and an astronomical observatory. The city flourished between 800 and 1200 CE, which places it mostly in the post-classic period of the Maya, the period just before European conquest of the area. The buildings are decorated with bright, colorful paintings and painted relief sculpture. Popular themes include animals such as jaguars, coyotes, eagles, serpents, and mythological figures. Also found at Chichen Itza are chikmuls, altars in the shape of a reclining figure with hands resting at the sides. Chikmuls are common throughout Mesoamerica.
What is the Sutton-Hoo ship?
The Sutton-Hoo ship is an Anglo-Saxon burial ship. Discovered off the coast of England in 1939. The ship likely belonged to King Raedwald, who died in 625. And was purposefully sunk as a funerary memorial to an important person. No body was ever found aboard the Sutton-Hoo ship, however. So it is possible the ship served as a monument to someone who was buried in another location. The ship was over 90 feet long and filled with early medieval treasure, such as gold coins, armor, and jewel-encrusted accessories. The objects found with the Sutton-Hoo ship represent some of the most valuable examples of medieval Anglo-Saxon art.
Who is Titian?
Titian is the nickname of Tiziano Vecchiaio, who started his career as Giorgian's assistant and went on to become the official painter to the Republic of Venice. Titian essentially picked up where Giorgian left off after his early death, and worked on a number of paintings attributed by some to Giorgian. Titian was a highly regarded painter during his long life and was even praised by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who wanted only Titian to paint his portrait. Titian worked in oil, and was known to finely grind his pigments and apply many layers of glaze to the surface of his canvas. As a result, Titian's paintings are nearly unparalleled in their vibrancy and color.
What is mana?
Mana is an important concept in much Pacific art that is essential for understanding the power of art in many Pacific cultures. Mana is a sacred, spiritual power possessed by individuals and art objects alike. It is invisible but formidable, and the amount of mana one has is related to one's proximity to the gods. For example, a tribal chief and related nobles have mana because of their divine lineage. Mana can be gained or lost based on one's actions or behaviors, such as through acts of strength or acts of cowardice, for example. The mana of a work of art is related to the status and skill of the artist who created the piece, as well as the materials used to make it, the age of the object, and the rituals for which it is used.
What is Orpheism?
Orphism, sometimes called Orphic Cubism, is a movement that developed within Cubism, and is characterized by abstractions and rhythmic color arranged to emphasize the joyous power of creation and the relationship between visual art and music. The name Orphism was coined by French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, 1880–1918, and the name refers to the mythological figure Orpheus, a poet whose beautiful lyrics and music could seduce wild animals. One of the major artists associated with Orphism was Robert Delaunay, 1885–1941, who passed through a Cubist phase and experimented with color theory and concepts of space. Much like his fellow Cubists, Braque and Picasso, Delaunay created color abstractions such as simultaneous contrasts, sun and moon. 1913, that relied on color interactions to create a sense of depth and movement. Delaunay's wife Sonia also created Orphic works, including paintings, collages, and clothing designs. By 1914, Apollinaire and Delaunay could no longer agree on the main tenets of Orphism and the movement ended.
Who was James van der Zee?
James van der Zee, 1886–1983, was an African-American photographer who documented the emerging black middle class in New York City during the Harlem Renaissance. He was primarily a portrait photographer and worked in his studio, though he experimented with double exposures and retouching. Van der Zee painted studio backdrops for indoor photo shoots, and even provided props and costumes for his sitters, often commemorating important life events such as weddings or family gatherings. Van der Zee's work captures the hopes and dreams of Black Americans arriving in the city from the rural South and remains one of the most significant records of the Harlem Renaissance. His collected works are now held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
What is Machu Picchu?
Machu Picchu was a 15th-century royal estate constructed by the Inca king Pachacuti, high in the Andes Mountains near Cuzco, Peru. A great deal of mystery and wonder surrounds this long-forgotten and well-preserved site, which caught public attention and public imagination after American archaeologist Hiram Bingham studied it in 1911. Machu Picchu sits at an elevation of 9,000 feet. The site consists of stone buildings, terraced farm plots, open plazas, and religious shrines. The architecture at Machu Picchu matches other Inca sites and was built out of granite using Inca masonry techniques. a style of stone construction that consisted of joining pillow-shaped blocks without mortar. Similar construction can be seen throughout the city of Cuzco, as well as on a large scale in the fortress palace, Sacsayhuaman, in the hills outside of the city.
What was the purpose of Emperor Qin's terracotta army?
Accidentally discovered in 1974 in Lintung, China, the massive burial monument for Emperor Qin Shi Huang contains over 7,000 life-size terracotta soldiers and horses, all standing in formation. Each soldier was painted and assembled from a series of molded parts, and therefore has a surprisingly realistic and individualized look. The burial chamber is as large and grand as the emperor's palace while he was alive, and is part of an ancient Chinese tradition of burying rulers with the wealth and the living staff they possessed during their life, much like the ancient Egyptians. The terracotta army protects the emperor and his material goods in perpetuity, serving their leader even after his death.
Who is Yinkashoni Bear, MBE?
Yinka Shonibare, 1962, is a British Nigerian artist whose work takes many forms, including video, photography, installation, and performance. Some of his most well-known work questions racial identity and relationships between cultures in a post-colonial world. His sculptural work, Scramble for Africa, 2003, depicts headless European leaders dressed in European-style clothes made with African-printed fabrics as they divide up the resources of the continent amongst themselves. He was made a member of the British Empire, MBE, by Britain's Queen Elizabeth II in 2005.
What was the Aztec religion?
The Aztec religion was influenced by the beliefs and mythologies of other Mesoamerican cultures such as the Olmec, Maya, Teotihuacan, and Toltec. As in other Mesoamerican religions, human sacrifice was an important part of the religion, and was linked to cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. The Aztec emphasized the importance of the sun as well as over 1,000 powerful, yet occasionally fallible, deities. Huitzilopochtli was the god of war and the sun who, according to mythology, led the Aztecs to the location where they founded the city of Tenochtitlan. One of the most popular deities was the heroic Quetzalcoatl, who was often depicted in art as a feathered serpent. Religion was an extremely important part of everyday life for the Aztecs.
What is a flying buttress?
A flying buttress is a graceful masonry support that projects from the side of a wall and adds strength to arches and piers that bear heavy loads. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris is known for its flying buttresses, some of which can be seen on the exterior of the apse. The delicate cascade of the flying buttress belies its serious structural role. Without the flying buttress, Gothic cathedrals could not have reached the awesome heights they are known for.
What is a thanka?
The thanka is a painted banner, and an important form of Tibetan art. Thankas often depict important people such as spiritual and political leaders in a way similar to Byzantine icons, which suggests that those individuals depicted in thankas have reached a semi-divine status. The thanka of Green Tara is nearly 2 feet long and depicts the protective Tibetan deity, Green Tara, who personifies transcendent wisdom and is often thought of as the universal mother figure to Buddhas. Made with ink and color on canvas, this 13th century thanka shows the deity surrounded by architectural forms and 17 species of the Bodhi tree. This particular thanka is part of the Indian and Southeast Asian art collection at the Cleveland Art Museum.
How did art change in the 19th century?
During the 19th century, the world experienced massive social upheavals due to the Industrial Revolution. The German philosophers Friedrich Engels, 1820–1895, and Karl Marx, 1818–1883, authors of the Communist Manifesto, 1848, believed that the working class, the proletariat, would soon revolt against the bourgeois. Marx in particular was interested in the artist as a member of the proletariat, whose work art was consumed and exploited by the upper classes. Because of the new availability of manufactured goods, handmade items and traditional crafts took on new value. Other important thinkers also affected 19th century perceptions of art, such as Sigmund Freud, 1856–1923, an Austrian neurologist who is credited with founding psychoanalysis, which inspired many artists and writers. The 19th century also saw the rise of the newspaper, and along with it, the rise in the importance of the art critic, whose voice became ever more important in judging and valuing art. Unlike in previous centuries, museums and galleries became important public and business institutions. A change from the previous system of royal or church patronage that characterized art production during the Renaissance. Towards the middle of the 19th century, Romanticism faded and realism became more popular in European art. By the end of the century, the public was shocked by Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, which evolved from realism and, in some cases, a new interest in psychology.
How did the ancient Chinese cast bronze?
The ancient Chinese used a technique known as piece mold bronze casting to make their ritual vessels and other bronze work. The first step was to make a clay model of the entire piece, including all of the decorations. Another heavier clay was then packed around this model, which formed a mold. After the clay dried, the mold was cut into pieces which released the interior model. The mold, now reassembled, could be filled with molten bronze. Bronze, an alloy of tin and copper, plus other metals, becomes molten at 1,800 degrees and requires an enormous amount of labor to manipulate.
Who was Andy Warhol?
Andy Warhol, 1928 to 1987, was an iconic artist celebrity whose pop art images of camels, soup cans and film celebrities continue to be highly recognizable and immensely valuable. Popularly known for his bleach blonde hair, dark sunglasses, and turtleneck sweaters, Andy Warhol was interested in stripping mass media images of their symbolic value, thus rendering them anew. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Warhol studied at the Carnegie Institute and moved to New York City in 1949, where he began a career in commercial art. He also worked in painting, printmaking, sculpture, and film. Warhol's New York studio, dubbed The Factory, was where Warhol and his team of assistants used silk screen machines to mass-produce images. His goal was to mechanically produce familiar images until they no longer held any meaning. Like saying the same word over and over until it sounds like nonsense. This explains paintings such as Fragile Handle with Care, which depicts the word fragile repeatedly, until the words become nearly abstract. Similarly, Warhol made an 8-hour-long film of the Empire State Building, created using a single, drawn-out shot. Warhol's work dominated the 1960s art and fashion scene, and he continued to push boundaries into the 1980s, with celebrity portraits and continued exploitation of celebrity.
What is the art of Neolithic China?
In China, the Neolithic period lasted from 10,000 BCE to 2000 BCE. Multiple different cultural groups created art during this time, each with a distinctive style. The Yangshao culture, which developed along the Yellow River, produced painted pottery. Before the invention of the potter's wheel, by hand coiling clay into a shape and then smoothing the edges and decorating the vessels with red and black paint using a brush. Most of these earthenware vessels were decorated with either animal motifs or complex abstract danes. Another style of Neolithic pottery is associated with the Hemidu, Dongkao, Longshan, and Liangzhu cultures, which were established across many regions of China. This style is known for tripod-shaped pottery and jade carving. One of the most important forms of art in China. Common forms of Neolithic jade include the bai, disc, and the kong. A short rectangular column with a hole through the center and decorated corners. Because of the lack of written records, the meaning of both the bai and the kong forms are unknown.
What is a formal analysis?
A formal analysis is a method of understanding a work of art by studying a work's formal qualities, including shape, color, line space, and texture. A formal analysis should include as much detail as possible with the goal of understanding how a particular work of art visually communicates ideas to a viewer.
What is the Vitruvian Man?
The Vitruvian Man is a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci of a visual concept, described by the Roman architect Vitruvius in the 1st century B. CE in his work on architecture. As an architect, Vitruvius was interested in harmony, symmetry, and balance, all qualities that were highly valued by classically minded artists and architects during the Renaissance, including Leonardo da Vinci. He explained his belief that supremely beautiful and unified architecture could be created using the proportions of the human body as a guide. As Vitruvius never provided any illustrations of his own, many different artists attempted to visually depict the concept. Da Vinci's drawing is likely the most familiar version. An idealized human male is depicted standing tall within a circle and a square. The figure's outstretched arms are shown in duplicate. One set reaches the point at which the circle meets the square, while the second set runs horizontally, reaching the vertical sides of the square. The figure also has two pairs of legs, one straight, and one outstretched, mirroring the position of the arms. The drawing highlights Leonardo da Vinci's mathematical creativity and emphasizes the Renaissance preference for geometric balance.
What were the dominant styles of architecture in the Spanish New World?
In Spanish Latin American, Baroque styles of architecture remained popular long after it had fallen out of fashion in Europe. Throughout the 18th century, magnificent examples of Baroque architecture continued to be built in countries such as Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, and even further afield in the Philippines. The Church of Saints Sebastian and Santa Prisco, in Tascata Alarcon, Mexico, is a good example of an 18th century Baroque church heavily decorated in stucco sculpture in a popular style known as the churrigueresque. Near Tucson, Arizona, the Mission San Xavier del Bac was also built in the 18th century and reflected Spanish Baroque styles. The nearly 100-foot-long church was built using brick and mortar, rather than adobe, which was commonly used by the native people of Arizona.
What is Romanticism?
Romanticism was an intellectual, cultural, and artistic movement that went against the rationalism of the Enlightenment and instead emphasized emotion and subjectivity. Romanticism developed in the mid-18th century and remained popular until well into the mid-19th century. It coincided with neoclassicism, and some neoclassical art is even considered romantic, because of its frequent idealism and nostalgia for the past. During the Romantic period, there was a new interest in medieval literature, art, and architecture, inspiring Gothic revival, which was particularly popular in British domestic architecture. Romanticism transcends the visual arts and includes music and literature as well. Both Beethoven and Chopin are considered part of the Romantic movement, as are Victor Hugo, William Wordsworth, Herman Melville, and Edgar Allan Poe. Romantic painters include Thomas Gainsborough, William Blake, Francisco Goya, Theodore Géricault, Eugene Delacroix, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, John Constable, Joseph Mallard, William Turner, and the artists of the Hudson River School, among others.
Who were some influential Impressionists?
The core group of Impressionist painters was a close-knit group living in France. Some were even related. For example, the artist Berthe Morisot was married to Manet's brother. Though Manet is not officially considered an Impressionist, despite his major influence on them. The following list includes a selection of artists who are considered the major Impressionist innovators. Claude Monet, 1840 to 1926, Monet favored plein air, outdoor painting and is known for his landscapes, especially his water lily and haystack paintings. He painted the smoky interiors of train stations, and the facade of Rouen Cathedral more than 30 times. The term Impressionism comes from a description of his painting. Impression, Sunrise, 1873, by art critic Louis Leroy. Edgar Degas, 1834 to 1917, Degas was a painter, a printmaker, and a sculptor. And unlike other Impressionists, was not a fan of plein-air painting. Instead, he preferred to explore the effects of artificial lighting and usually worked in his studio. He is particularly well known for his paintings of ballet dancers, and his other famous works include El Absinthe, 1876, and a sculpture called Little Dancer of 14 Years. Now on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Berthe Morisot, 1841 to 1895, Morisot's work focused on landscapes and domestic scenes that highlighted the female experience. She regularly showed her work at the Salon and continued to paint professionally. even after marriage to Eugene Manet, which was uncommon for the time. Morisot had a close professional relationship with her brother-in-law, Eduard Manet, and they clearly influenced one another. Some of her most recognizable works include The Cradle, 1872, and Summer's Day, 1879. Auguste Renoir, 1841–1919, Renoir was a close friend of Monet's and his work often features dappled light and outdoor urban scenes, such as Moulin de la Galette, 1876, which depicts colorfully dressed dancers at an outdoor dance hall in the Montmartre neighborhood of Paris. His paintings are often cheerful and beautiful, and provide a snapshot of upper-class life in 19th-century France. Marie Cassatt, 1844–1926, Cassatt was born in Pennsylvania but spent her career in France. A friend of Degas, she also completed most of her work in the studio and she was a major supporter of Impressionism, even encouraging American friends and family to buy Impressionist art. Like Morisot, Cassatt focused on domestic scenes and the relationship between mothers and their children. Her work continues to be highly popular, and some of her well-known paintings include The Boating Party, 1893–1894, T, 1880, and The Child's Bath, 1893. She was awarded the French Legion of Honor in 1904. Camille Pissarro, 1830–1903, Pissarro was a highly innovative artist who preferred plein-air painting and drew inspiration from the countryside and rural peasantry. Many of his paintings depict agricultural scenes. Pissarro applied thick globs of paint to his canvases, which didn't always win him favor with the critics, but greatly influenced the following generation of post-impressionists. Notable works include Avenue de l'Opéra, Paris, 1898, and his many paintings of the village of Pontoise.
What is post-impressionism?
Post-impressionism is a tricky category. The term literally means after impressionism, though the fact that some artists are considered both impressionists and post-impressionists, like Paul Cézanne and Georges Seurat, doesn't help. Neither does the fact that most of these artists went through an impressionist phase, and that some are also considered to be neo-impressionists, a term invented by 19th century art critic Félix Finian to describe pointillism, a style attributed to Seurat. Regardless, the term post-impressionism is used to describe late 19th century art that rejects the spontaneity of impressionism and is characterized by bright colors and defined brush strokes. Post-impressionist artists were not as eager as the impressionists to dissolve form in their work, and therefore post-impressionism can be recognized by its relatively clear outlines. The most important post-impressionists include Paul Cézanne, Vincent van Gogh, and Paul Gauguin. And other significant artists include Georges Seurat, and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, among others.
Who invented photography?
The process of photography, in which an image is fixed by recording light through chemical and now digital means, was not invented by a single individual. The concept had been around for thousands of years in the form of the camera obscura. A small, dark box with a tiny hole on one side that allows light to enter. The light reveals an image from outside the box, which is either reflected onto a surface with a small mirror, or passes through onto a wall. A large-scale camera obscura can even be made in a darkened room. Artists used the camera obscura to view small details in a scene. Scholars hypothesize that Johannes Vermeer and other 18th-century artists may have used such a device to achieve such heightened detail in their work. The problem for artists, however, was to take the image produced by the camera obscura and make it permanent. The first person to do this was Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre, a painter.
What is Islamic art?
This is particularly challenging question to answer. The religion of Islam began in the Middle East during the 7th century, and quickly spread east across Central Asia to parts of China and Southeast Asia, and west into large areas of North and Central Africa, and Europe. The term Islamic art does not necessarily indicate that the art is religious in subject matter, but refers to art produced by cultures that practice Islam. Islamic art is therefore incredibly diverse, and influenced by both religion and secular cultural values. Some of the most common types of Islamic art include carpets and tapestries, calligraphy, book decoration, metalwork, and architecture.
What is El Escorial?
El Escorial is an enormous monastery palace built by Spanish King Philip II in Madrid between 1563 and 1584. Philip II took over control of Spain after his father, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, abdicated. Philip was therefore one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, controlling territories in Spain, the Netherlands, Milan, Burgundy, Naples, and even the Americas. Philip II was a devout Catholic, and El Escorial combined a seminary, convent, and basilica with the royal palace. The main architect was Juan Bautista de Toledo until his death, when Juan de Herrera took over, eventually completing the project. The building design is reminiscent of Italian classicism, but it is formidable and severe, reflecting the power of the Spanish crown.
What is Knock sculpture?
Some of Africa's earliest art has been found in modern day Nigeria and was created by the Neolithic Nok people of that region. Many archaeological fragments from approximately 500 to 200 BCE have been found. Accidentally during tin mining work, including fragments of human and animal sculpture. The discovered sculptures can vary greatly in size. Some are quite small while others are nearly life-size. Made from terracotta, these simple yet expressive pieces often have large heads and stylized facial features. They are usually hollow and have open orifices, such as in the nose and mouth. Some figures are standing, kneeling, or seated. Their exact function is unknown, but it is thought that the artists may have been women.
What is vestigial?
The violence and destruction of World War I shocked the world, and groups of artists responded in various ways. For Dutch painter and architect Theo van Doesburg, 1884-1931, and Dutch painters Piet Mondrian, 1872-1944, and Bart van der Lek, 1876-1958. The goal was to create art that promoted universal peace and harmony, both visually and politically. They named their movement de stijl, which literally means the style. De stijl is characterized by flat colors and simplified rectilinear forms, a result of the group's need for visual clarity and mathematical simplification. De stijl is considered to be reductive because visual complexity has been distilled or reduced to only the most pure, meaningful elements. For example, de stijl artists preferred primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, or neutral colors such as black, white, and gray. The term de stijl can be used to describe painting, furniture design, and architecture. Works include Gerrit Rietveld's Red Blue Chair, 1923. The Schroeder House in the Netherlands, and the paintings of Piet Mondrian.
Who was Manet?
Eduard Manet, 1832-1883, is considered by many to be the first modern painter. He not only bridged the gap between realism and impressionism, but his work foreshadows early 20th century painting styles and approaches. He was highly knowledgeable about art history, and fiercely rebellious. Preferring art he deemed sincere, rather than perfect. Along with thousands of paintings by other premier artists of his day, Manet's work was rejected by the Salon, the official art exhibition of the Palace of Fine Arts. But, Manet had the opportunity to shock critics and viewers at a specially organized Salon de Refuses, or Salon of the Rejected, with his painting Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. The Luncheon on the Grass, 1863, and again in 1865 with another masterpiece, Olympia. Though Manet's work drew inspiration from the great masters, he focused on scenes of modern life, including cafe and leisure scenes around Paris, war paintings, and lithographs inspired by contemporary literature. His work is among the most critically acclaimed and valuable in all of art history. However, Manet never achieved this kind of universal recognition during his lifetime. Now, he is considered one of the founding fathers of modern art.
What is the difference between naturalism and realism?
Naturalism, sometimes confused with realism, is a mode in which an artist attempts to objectively represent the natural world. Artists interested in naturalism spend a great deal of time looking and thinking about the observable qualities of the visual world, while the term realism is sometimes used interchangeably with naturalism, and also refers to art that accurately depicts the visible world. The term is slightly broader, encompassing the sometimes harsh reality of everyday life. Realism, with a capital R, also refers to a series of different art movements including the 19th century realist movement in France, as well as Soviet-era socialist realism.
What was the Gothic revival?
Also known as the Neo-Gothic movement, the Gothic revival was an 18th 19th century architectural movement characterized by the revival of medieval style, and coincided with the increased popularity of medieval literature and poetry. A good example of Gothic revival architecture is Strawberry Hill, the private home of Horace Walpole, 1717 to 1797, in Twickenham, England. Walpole's home design included round turrets topped with crenellated battlements, tooth-like notches used for defense in medieval buildings, and pointed arch tracery windows similar to those found in French Gothic cathedrals. Another example of Gothic revival architecture is the Palace of Westminster in London, which was rebuilt after a fire in 1834. Gothic revival architecture was a popular style for universities both in Europe and the United States, including the University of Glasgow, the University of Chicago, and the City College of New York, among many others.
What were the major art traditions of the woodland period?
The two dominant art traditions of the woodland period were the art of the Adena culture and the Hopewell. These cultures shared a number of visual motifs and symbols, and greatly influenced the art of other native North American cultures across the continent. Both the Adena and the Hopewell were known for building large-scale earthworks as well as smaller pieces of sculpture and jewelry, often made from copper, or cut from mica, a layered silicate mineral. Because of the plundering of sites and an overall lack of documentation, A great deal remains unknown about the art traditions of the Adena and Hopewell.
Who was Hans Holbein?
Hans Holbein the Younger, c. 1497 to 1543, was a leading German painter who went on to become the court painter to English King Henry VIII. Holbein was a skilled realist with great ability to capture texture and fine detail. His work included religious paintings, prints, and even designs for stained glass windows. But he was particularly well known for his portraits, especially his portrait of Henry VIII in 1540. The painting depicts the formidably sized king dressed in his finest clothes against a dark background. The king wears an ornately embroidered coat with yellow, puffed sleeves, fine jewelry, and a feathered hat in celebration of his marriage to Anne of Clovis, his fourth wife. The oil paint captures the rich textures of the fabric and Holbein emphasizes the girth and power of the king's frame. The king's decision to invite a German painter, rather than an Italian artist, to his court highlights the strain between England and Italy after the Reformation.
Why did ballerina dancers fascinate Degas?
Edgar Degas' paintings of young ballet dancers were neither erotic nor psychologically engaged. Like other Impressionists, Degas was fascinated by light. And dancers provided Degas many opportunities to experiment with light, as they were usually illuminated by heavy artificial spotlights and other types of stage lighting. In his 1877 painting, Dancer with a Bouquet, Bowing, a ballet dancer's face becomes mask-like and garish under the harsh floor lights running along the stage. In addition to light, Degas also explored figurative movement. Another interest that benefited from using the flexible dancer as a subject. Many of Degas' paintings feature dancers as they are stretching and preparing for a performance, such as his 1879 pastel drawing, Awaiting the Cue. Focusing on dancers allowed Degas to represent surprising angles and poses of the human body. These paintings often feature an angular, cropped quality that brings the drama of light and movement to the forefront, and also shows the influence of Japanese prints.
What did Etruscan temples look like?
Etruscan temples were greatly inspired by Greek architecture, and went on to influence Roman temple architecture. Etruscan temples were nearly square and raised on a tall foundation known as a podium. Built of mud bricks, about half of the temple was devoted to 3 interior rooms, and the other half was made up of a large porch supported by a double rows of columns. Columns were made either of wood, or volcanic rock called tufa. These relatively simple buildings were elaborately painted and decorated with architectural sculpture. Not on the pediment, as the Greeks would have done, but on the roof. Etruscan temple sculpture was made from terracotta, a challenging material to work with. And they precariously placed their pieces along rooflines and ridgepoles. Overall, an Etruscan temple looks small and heavy. Supporting a cast of terracotta gods and goddess milling around on its roof.
What is Angkor Wat?
Angkor Wat is an enormous Hindu temple complex in Cambodia featuring a series of walled courtyards leading to a group of central towers. Built over 30 years by the Khmer king Suryavarman II during the first half of the 12th century. Angkor Wat's 5 lotus-shaped towers each symbolize peaks of Mount Meru, a mountain considered sacred in Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist traditions. The central tower is approximately 200 feet tall and the entire complex is aligned with the sun. So that on the summer solstice, the sun rises up directly over the central tower when viewed from the western gate. Suryavarman II's goal was to associate himself with the god Vishnu and the entire temple. Complex is covered in miles of relief carvings depicting the king and the many avatars of Vishnu.
Who is Cindy Sherman?
Cindy Sherman, 1954, is a postmodern photographer known for her conceptual manipulations of media images and her use of self-portraiture. Sherman's photographs explore feminine identity and question the way women are portrayed in art and popular culture. In her series Untitled Film Stills, from the late 1970s and early 1980s, Sherman takes on the role of a female icon, a blonde bombshell such as Marilyn Monroe, and other stereotypical clichés. Her characters range from self-aware to subdued to comical. Her later work takes on art history. In Untitled number 224, Sherman becomes Bacchus, the ancient god of wine as imagined in the work of Baroque artist Caravaggio. Her eyes peering out from under a crown of grape leaves. Through her work, Cindy Sherman becomes the composite of the many images and film references she makes, leading the viewer to question the reality or artificiality of not only the artist's identity, but of the way in which subjects are portrayed in art and popular culture.
Who was Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec?
Artists such as Cézanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh sacrificed three-dimensional realism in an attempt to express a new kind of authenticity, or truth, in their work. The result was pictures that often looked flat, and emphasized boldness of color over depth and space. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, 1864–1901, made paintings and posters that shared many of these qualities. Toulouse-Lautrec was fascinated by the Bohemian Montmartre, an entertainment district in Paris where many Impressionist artists lived and worked, including Edgar Degas, who was a major influence on Toulouse-Lautrec. He was physically impaired due to a combination of illness and childhood accidents, which resulted in stunted growth in his legs and difficulty with mobility. Perhaps because of this, he was enamored with the dance halls and nightclubs of Montmartre, and many of his elegant paintings and posters illustrate lively dancers and cafe patrons chatting, moving, and having a great time. His painting, At the Moulin Rouge, 1892–1895, depicts a scene at one of the most popular clubs in Paris at the time, the Moulin Rouge. To the far right, a green-faced dancer, May Milton, is reminiscent of Degas dancers under the sharp artificial lights of the theater. At some point in history, someone cut her out of the picture, possibly due to her strange appearance and scandalous personality in real life, though the cut piece has since been reattached. Toulouse-Lautrec's posters, such as Moulin Rouge, La Gaulle, 1891, feature outlined forms and flat colors similar to Japanese woodblock prints.
How do you read a work of art?
When a piece of street art catches your eye, or you find yourself walking slowly through the rooms of an art museum, you may not necessarily feel the need to read a work of art. Art moves us, and we respond emotionally to the beautiful, disturbing, and mysterious sights around us. A portrait of a mother and a child, such as Mary Cassatt's painting The Bath, might cause you to reflect on your own familial relationships. Or, you may find yourself curiously transfixed by the sheer enormity of Claes Oldenburg and Kusch van Bruggen's 5,500-pound shuttlecock, perched precariously in the garden of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, Missouri. Sometimes, however, we want to dig deeper and investigate the meaning of art.
What is arte povera?
Arte povera, meaning poor art or impoverished art, is a movement that emphasized the use of everyday objects and aims to broaden just what can be considered art. The term was invented by Italian artist German Selland in 1967 and is related to similar movements such as art informal. Artists associated with arte povera include Greek artist Janis Kounellis, 1933. As well as Italians Giulio Paolini, 1940, and Michelangelo Pistoletto, 1933. Pistoletto is famous for his arte povera work, Venus of the Rags, 1967, in which a glimmering sculpture of Venus, the goddess of love, with her back turned to the viewer, is juxtaposed with a large, colorful pile of rags. Countess also contrasts refined classicism with the everyday in his Untitled from 1978, in which fragments of a classical sculpture are held together with cord.
How did Cézanne astonish Paris with an apple?
Paul Cézanne, 1839 to 1906, is considered one of the most significant post-impressionists and an artist who made a lasting impact on modern art. His earlier work was in line with the Impressionists and even influenced by Romanticism. But as he matured, he began to emphasize form over narrative. This means that Cézanne became more concerned with creating an awareness of the physical qualities of his paintings than with telling any particular stories. Cézanne's still lives, such as Still Life with Apples, c. 1875 to 1876, use color, rather than outline, to create form. He didn't always use a brush, but often applied paint to the canvas directly with his palette knife. Cézanne wanted to push the boundaries of art, wanted to make an impression. To astonish Paris with an apple, as he said. The apples in Still Life with Apples are an arrangement. Much like the undefined smudges of Whistler's Nocturne in black and gold. Brightly colored against a darker background. The apples have a life of their own and engage the viewer by bobbing in an abstract, gravity-free space. Cézanne's apples are not mere fruit, but are painted forms that morph the still life into an association of structures built by color, rather than subject.
Who were the Fauve?
Considered the first modernist movement of the 20th century, the so-called Fauve or wild beasts were a loosely associated group of artists working in Paris who used bright, garish colors in an unusually expressive way. The group included Henri Matisse, 1869 to 1954, André Derain, 1880 to 1954, and Maurice de Vlaminck, 1876 to 1958, among other artists known as Fauvettes. Their name came from French art critic Louis Vauxcelles, who was shocked by the brashness of the art on display at their Salon d'Automne in Paris in 1905. The Fauve used bold colors to express emotions, and they were inspired by Gauguin's use of color and Seurat's pointillist experiments in which he placed divergent colors next to one another to make them pop. A good example of the Fauvist style is Matisse's The Woman with the Hat, 1905. A painting purchased by renowned modern art collectors Leo and Gertrude Stein. Matisse used loose brush strokes and bright, seemingly inappropriate colors to construct the image of a woman holding a white fan and wearing a disproportionately large hat. The woman's nose is composed of the same green color that is splashed across the background, and her neck is deep orange. The Fauve were free from the restrictions of a realist color palette, and with this freedom they went on to experiment with other styles and helped to usher in 20th century modernism.